The Quran admits repeatedly that the people around Muhammad kept accusing him of copying the stories of other groups. Surah 25, verses 4 to 5. And the disbelievers say, "This is not but a lie that he has fabricated, and another people have helped him in it. They have indeed produced a wrongdoing and a calumny. And they say, they are fables of those of old, which he has had written down, and they are recited to him morning and evening." Surah 6, verse 25. Those who disbelieve say, "This is naught but fables of those of old." Surah 9, verse 61. And among them are those who torment the Prophet and say, "He is an ear." They called Muhammad an ear because he would believe the stories of anyone who came to visit him. But don't take my word for that. We have the historical background in Ibn Ishaq, page 243, where one of his critics declared, "Muhammad is all ears. If anyone tells him anything, he believes it." Quite frequently, Muhammad plagiarized myths and legends from late apocryphal sources.
Faster than you could say mental hospitals disabled dead kids and hammers, David Wood keeps plagiarizing arguments that have been refuted over and over again. But it seems like David Wood is actually plagiarizing off someone named J. Smith and Islam Critiqued. Well, J. Smith came before Islam Critique, so let's just go with J. Smith. J. Smith actually brought up this argument way back in, or these types of arguments way back in his debates with Shabir Ali back in the year 2000 or 1999 or 2000. I can't remember the year, but I remember J. Smith would bring up this argument with his debates with Shabir Ali way back in the early days of Muslim-Christian debates in the 2000s. So J. Smith would bring up this argument that the Quran plagiarized off Old and New Testament apocryphal books. So this argument is not new. I mean, like, even before J. Smith, I mean, like, Orientalists from the, 19th to early 20th century have been bringing up this already inconsistent argument that the author of the Quran copied off Old Testament and New Testament apocryphal sources and apocryphal sources in general. Now, this whole argument, this is a very bad argument that Christians make, because this can backfire on both the Old and New Testaments, and we're going to be looking at some examples right now of how the Old Testament and the New Testament quote from these non-canonical or these apocryphal sources that that proves that these sources do have some truth or some true stories and sayings in them. So the problem with these critics like David Wood, Robert Spencer, Islam Critique, whose real name is Colin, would have to prove that these books were circulating in Arabia, or these stories were translated from Hebrew, Greek, Syriac into Arabic and were circulating in Arabia in the 5th and 6th century in Mecca and Medina. This is impossible to prove. How can you prove this? How can these critics prove that these specific stories were translated from Hebrew, Greek, Syriac from the north, and somehow they made it into, the Arabs in the south, and these Arabs were translating these books into Arabic and circulating, the stories in Arabia in the 5th and 6th centuries in Mecca and Medina? This is impossible to prove. They'll never be able to prove that. Also, a lot of these sources, they say plagiarized by the Prophet Muhammad, came after the death of the Prophet Muhammad. For example, the Alexander Romance, which has been proven to be written at least 50 to 100 years after the death of the Prophet Muhammad, in the completion of the Quran. So the Alexander Romance that they say the Quran plagiarized off of came 50 to 100 years after the death of the Prophet Muhammad. So how can the Prophet Muhammad copy something that came after his death? It doesn't make any sense. So, the Alexander Romance is just one example. Another example is the Arabic infancy gospel of Jesus Christ, which came which came 300 years after the death of the Prophet Muhammad in the completion of the Quran. So a lot of these sources actually came after the Quran. They don't predate the Quran. But anyways, the Quran says that Allah is the one revealing these stories in the Quran, chapter 25, verse 6. That means that there could be true stories found in these apocryphal stories or these apocryphal sources, like the infancy gospel of Thomas, etc. And the Quran could be confirming that these true story could be confirming that these are true stories by repeating them. So, like all these apocryphal sources, these Old Testament and New Testament apocryphal books do contain true stories and sayings in them, and the Quran could just be confirming these stories or confirming that these are true stories by repeating them. I mean, there's nothing unbelievable about that. Moreover, the Bible, both the Old and New Testaments, does the same as the Quran. It quotes or repeats apocryphal works as facts and as true stories, and we're going to take a look at some examples where both the Old and New Testaments quote from these apocryphal sources as having true stories and sayings in them. So let's look at some examples. The Old Testament repeatedly quotes non-biblical sources as truthful. For instance, the Old Testament refers to the book of the wars of the Lord in Numbers 21:14. Again, that's not found in the canonical Old Testament we have today. The book of Jasher in Joshua chapter 10 verse 13, and 2 Samuel chapter 1 verse 18, and the Acts of Solomon in 1 Kings chapter 11 verse 41. So these are books not found in the Old Testament canon that we have today. Also, the Annals of King David in 1 Chronicles chapter 27 verse 24. So these are all books that we don't find in the Old Testament canon that we have today. The Jews obviously had canonical books which were inspired, and they had historical books which were uninspired. However, these books still contain some truth. Pagan poets sometimes speak the truth. In Numbers chapter 24 verse 17, at one point God even speaks truth through a donkey, like the movie Shrek or something. In Numbers chapter 22 verse 28, truth is truth no matter where it's found. So the Old Testament quotes from the book of the wars of the Lord and the book of Jasher, etc., which aren't found in the Old Testament canon we have today. So that means that the authors of the Old Testament were copying off books that we don't even have anymore. So that means these non-canonical books do have some truth in them because the Old Testament is quoting from them. Further, we read in the New Testament that the book of Jude copies off or quotes assumption of Moses in the book of Enoch. Neither of these books are in the Old Testament or inspired scripture. They are pseudepigraphical, uninspired books written outside of the Bible. Paul refers to the names of these magicians which aren't mentioned in the Old Testament in 2 Timothy chapter 3 verse 8. 2 Peter chapter 2 verse 4 copies and plagiarizes off 1 Enoch chapter 10 verse 4. And you can see the reference right there on the screen. There are many other examples of the New Testament plagiarizing and copying off the Old Testament apocryphal books, but these will suffice for now. So we can see that the New Testament does the same exact thing David Wood is accusing the Quran of. It copies and plagiarizes off Old Testament and or Old Testament apocryphal works. Now, even Christian scholars admit that the New Testament apocryphal Gospels do contain true stories and sayings about Jesus. See the Oxford Bible Commentary, page 1307, The Historical Reliability of the Gospels by Craig L. Blomberg, pages 279 to 280. So even conservative or Christian scholars admit that the New Testament apocryphal Gospels do contain true stories about Jesus. So the Quran repeating these stories found in the infancy gospel of Thomas or something like that doesn't threaten its credibility. there are true stories found in these New Testament apocryphal sources, and the Quran could be repeating these true stories. So just because a story is found in the Quran and in the New Testament apocryphal Gospels, that doesn't mean that those stories are false. Because they come from the New Testament Apocrypha. According to Christian scholars themselves, they even admit that the New Testament Apocrypha or the pseudepigraphical Gospels do contain true stories about Jesus. So even these Christian scholars are admitting that there are true stories and sayings about Jesus found in these apocryphal New Testament Gospels. So this is not a threat to the reliability of the Quran, because the Quran could be repeating true stories found in these apocryphal stories or these apocryphal Gospels. So the conclusion we can draw here is that this whole argument is a fallacy, which can be explained by these sources having some truth in them, which the Quran could be confirming by repeating. Also, the Bible, both the Old and New Testaments, do the same thing. Quote from apocryphal sources, these apocryphal or these non-canonical sources as having truth in them. So we saw examples from both the Old and New Testament where the Old and New Testaments are quoting from non-canonical sources. And the defense Christian apologists or scholars give for this is that the Bible, both the authors of the Old Testament and New Testament, are quoting true stories and sayings, and they even admit that truth is truth no matter where it's found. So this whole argument is a genetic fallacy and the post ergo propter hoc fallacy. These are fallacies that state the thing before caused the thing after, and the genetic fallacy is attacking the source of the claim instead of the claim itself. Genetic fallacy is like saying, my second grade teacher is evil. She said 2 plus 2 equals 4. Therefore, she can't be trusted because I don't like her. She's evil. So that's a genetic fallacy. The genetic fallacy is attacking the source of the claim, and saying the source is a bad source. Therefore, we can't get any truth out of that source. So this whole argument that the Quran copied off these older New Testament apocryphal works is a fallacy. It's a genetic fallacy and the post ergo propter hoc fallacy. So David Wood doesn't understand logic, or logic and reasoning goes out the window when he's trying to critique Islam. So if this disproves the Quran, it also disproves the Bible, which the critics won't admit to. So they won't play the same, or they won't play the same critical game with the Bible, because the Bible does the same exact thing the Quran does. It quotes and repeats stories from these non-canonical apocryphal sources. So this is a inconsistent argument, and this is a fallacy, which the critics do, and they ignore the Bible, and they always want to point the finger at Islam, which